everyone. It is 11. God is now beginning. That is behind. Do not trust that. It's behind in multiple ways. Your tuition at work. Okay, so today I'm hoping to finish the chapter on personality. This week is supposed to be on the chapter on stress, coping, and health, but that may have to get pushed a little bit into next week. I did my practice run through chapter 15, and it looks like it should only take me about one lecture, maybe a little more, a little less. So we should still have some time on Tuesday for exam review. So just a reminder, next week, so next Tuesday, is a good day to bring questions, because we'll be going over everything in the prior 3 chapters that lead up to the third test. Another reminder that the third test is a bit longer than the prior 2. So the test is next Thursday. So it will be 60 multiple choice questions and 1 written. So if you felt like you were crunched for time, which most people weren't, but if you felt like you were crunched for time in tests 1 and 2, that's a sign that you should study more, that you should be more well prepared to answer the questions in a more timely fashion. You'll also be pleased to know I got new markers, so for the people at the back, they'll be a bit sharper. Woo! Okay, so we finished last class just before the trait approach. So reminder that the definition of personality that this book gives is a stable pattern of thought, emotion, and behavior. A trait is a stable aspect of that pattern, or a stable part of it. And there are different ways of breaking down personality into these traits. So one that we'll be talking about in actually multiple trait models is extroversion. That's one that multiple models kind of converge on as being important. So that would be an example of a trait. The way that you try to arrive at what the main traits are is something we saw back in the chapter on intelligence, which is factor analysis. So factor analysis is when you take, it could be anything, anything that varies, but in this case, responses to questionnaires, so test items, and you look at how they correlate with each other. And what you find is that some kind of groups of items tend to go together. So an example I used last time to make it intuitive, if I was to ask everyone in this room, how much alcohol have you had to drink in the last month, how much marijuana have you smoked in the last month, and how many parties have you been to in the last month, probably those 3 would go together to some extent. People who gave high answers to, let's say, the alcohol question, like, I don't mean high like you smoke, I mean like they give a higher answer, they've drank more alcohol. On average, people who say they've drank more alcohol will probably also have smoked more marijuana and been to more parties, on average. With factor analysis, you can take a big body of items and look at what the main factors are. So this is what was used with mental tests in the context of intelligence. And this is a bit of an oversimplified way of representing it, but what you find is all mental tests are positively correlated. If you take just a quick pass, kind of a first approximation, there's one factor that seems to explain a big chunk of the variance. And the term for that was G, the general factor, or general cognitive ability. In the case of personality, almost no one thinks that it's useful to talk about the one main dimension of personality. It's pretty clear that you have to break it down into multiple. The question is how many? Now, but before getting into the question of how many, just to reinforce the idea of how factor analysis is done, I have a video from Jordan Peterson. Now, Jordan Peterson is someone who people either love or hate. I've never really loved or hated him. Some of what he says is very crazy, but within his area of expertise, he's actually quite good. So he actually has done serious research into personality theory, so he gives a pretty good explanation here of how factor analysis works. Okay, well said. So that should reinforce the idea. Now, we can't go into too much detail here, but one thing you'll kind of have to take my word for is, to some extent, how many factors you choose to use is partly a matter of choice. You can always break it down into more factors if you want to. So this isn't exactly right, but in the case of personality, it might look something kind of like this. So you give people a bunch of personality questions, as many as you can think of. So you look at this, so the closer the dots are together, these dots would be like questions that you gave people. You could represent it statistically. The closer they are together, the more they covary, the more they tend to go together. Now, how many factors do we want to extract? Well, one thing we could do is extract two. We could say these two are two factors. And the first approach we're going to look at basically says that. There's two big factors. But then you zoom in on each of those and you think, well, I don't know, maybe we want to make this a factor and this a factor, and this one too. And if you wanted to go really extreme, you could say, forget this factor analysis business, let's just have every question be a trait. Now, that would be pretty silly. But what do we want? So the more factors we have, the more nuance we'll have, the more of the variation we'll be able to explain. But if we have too many factors, it's kind of useless, right? We're not really gaining any traction. We want to be able to kind of simplify the data a bit and have a smaller number of factors. As I say, this is to some degree a matter of choice. So one approach, Cattell, had 16 factors. You do not need to memorize those, but that's just to reinforce the point that you can, if you want, break these down into a large number of traits. Ising had two, and these you should know. They are extroversion and stability. So if you want a really small number of factors, the kind of first two you get that explain the biggest chunk of the variance are extroversion and stability. Each of these will correspond roughly to one of the big five, which I'll say more about in a second. Ising did very serious work on these two. So just quickly to say, so extroversion, most of you probably already know that word, but if you're higher in extroversion, you're more outgoing, confident, you like people, you like being around people. If you are low, you're more shy and reserved. And stability has to do with kind of emotional stability. So if you're higher, you're more calm, collected, you're not subject to random changes in your emotions. If you're lower, you're a bit more neurotic, which is the term that the Big Five is going to use. A bit more unstable. So those are two that are good to know as a matter of history. But today, by far the most commonly used model of personality is the Big Five, sometimes called the five-factor model. These will be very important on the test. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. There's a nice acronym for remembering them, which is OCEAN. And this order does not correspond to their relative importance. If anything, probably the most important ones are the E and the N in terms of how much of the variance they explain, but this just makes it easier to memorize. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So I'll go through each of these one at a time. And I'll start by saying these names are just labels for clumps. So when you give people lots of personality questions, you find that they kind of coalesce into these 5 groups, at least according to the model that these theorists use. And there are kind of clusters of things that tend to go together, and these are just convenient labels for what kinds of questions are in those clumps. So the first one, openness, swallow a little bit of water down the wrong pipe, is openness to experience. So if you are higher in openness to experience, that means you like trying new things. You're more unconventional, more creative. You don't like doing the same thing over and over again. You like thinking about new ideas, trying new things, etc. If you are lower, you're more conventional. You like eating the same food, going to the same restaurant. You like a schedule. You don't like unpredictability. And probably not very creative. Conscientiousness corresponds to hard work and attention to detail. So if you're higher in conscientiousness, you're more organized, more hardworking, more industrious, maybe a little more picky, a little bit of a perfectionist. And if you're lower, you're more easygoing, more lazy, more disorganized, and so on. Extroversion, which is that one we already talked about. So if you're high in extroversion, you're more outgoing, socially confident, also more energetic and talkative. Whereas if you're lower, you're more shy, quiet, and inhibited. Agreeableness. This doesn't just mean like agreeing with people a lot. I was in a conversation with some psych graduate students, and I said, I'm pretty agreeable, but I like arguing with people. And they're like, well, that's a contradiction. It's like, no, agreeable just means how nice and polite are you? So if you're high in agreeableness, you tend to be more, nice, caring, empathetic. If you're too high, you can be a bit of a doormat. That's kind of a weakness. If you're too high, you might let people step all over you. If you're lower, you're more of an asshole. You're more of a hard ass, or you're a little more mean, more assertive would be the nice spin to put on it. Although it turns out you make more money. Agreeableness is negatively correlated with income. You could imagine different reasons for that. One reason might be that you're able to go into your boss's office, bang your fist on the table, and demand a raise. Whereas if you're agreeable, it's like, oh no, I'm getting paid enough, And then lastly, neuroticism is pretty similar to Ising's stability factor. The difference being neuroticism is sort of the opposite of stability. So high in neuroticism would mean low in stability. So neuroticism corresponds to sensitivity to negative emotion and emotional change. So if you're higher in neuroticism, your moods are more variable, and you're more susceptible to things like depression, anxiety, and things like that. Also more irritable. So there are different interesting things to talk about here. In a while, I'm going to talk about the reliability and validity of these. But I'll point out some potential points of interest. One point of interest is, are there any sex differences in these? And there are, but they tend to be fairly small. I'll show an example. The two that have the biggest differences in most studies are the bottom two, agreeableness and neuroticism. Both of them, women are on average somewhat higher. Here's an example of what that looks like. So the dotted line is the curve for females, and the solid line is the line for males. So yeah, you can see there's a difference in the average, but there's going to be lots of males and females at almost every level. However, one consequence of the way that, so as you can see, these are approximately normal distributions, right? They're approximately bell-shaped. One consequence of the way bell curves work is you can have fairly small differences in the average that translate to fairly large differences in the tails. So if we zoom in right here, so these are people who are very low in agreeableness. It's almost all men. Not entirely, there's a little dip there. So these are almost by definition psychopaths, right? People who are very low in agreeableness, kind of verging on evil, right? They just don't care about people at all. And I mean, if you want to know who these people are, just like go to a prison, right? It's going to mostly be males. These are the kinds of people who tend to wind up in prison for violence. So that's one consequence of the way these differences work. And as an analogy, you can think about height. So men are on average taller than women, but of course there's lots of tall women and short men. But if you go to the tails, so the very, very tall people, for example, like people who are 7 feet tall, almost all men, even if the difference in the middle is not especially large. One other interesting issue that these relate to is political differences. One trait that's correlated with political differences is openness. People who are higher in openness tend to be more politically liberal, and people who are low tend to be more politically conservative. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, right? So, you know, one synonym for being left-wing is progressive, right? You like change. You like to change society and move it forward. Whereas if you're conservative, society's fine the way it is. Just keep it the same. In fact, the connection is close enough that some Big Five questionnaires will actually include a political item. They'll just say, like, are you left-wing or right-wing? And that would be actually a component of the first dimension. This is good to remember. Political debates can often be very heated. It's helpful to remember that at least some of the time, political differences relate to differences in temperament, right? Differences in how people, how their personality is constituted. There's a really interesting book about this issue called Conflict of Visions. Which is about the kind of temperamental and outlook differences that left-wing and right-wing people tend to have. And if you had to summarize the kind of impulse that conservatives have, it's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's kind of like, things work basically pretty well, let's not change it. Whereas the core impulse of left-wing people is, society could be better and we should change it. And there's some value in both of those, impulses, right? So it's important to have both sorts of people. So very interesting book. That's something that relates to the first dimension. Now, before I say more about the validity and reliability of these factors, we're going to do a little activity, because I'm sure some of you are wondering where you would fall on this. So we'll have a little bit of fun today. We're going to do a Big Five test. And this one's a good one because, like the book, it breaks each of the 5 down into subcomponents. The book calls these behaviors. That's not the right thing to call them. These are facets. So if you look at if you have the book, it'll have the 5 factors, and then each of them breaks down into further things. The subcomponents are called facets, and the test that I'm going to show you does the same thing. For some of them, it gives the facets a slightly different name, but it's basically the same breakdown. So if you have a phone or a laptop, the test is big5-test.com. So on the screen, if you have a bad memory, so yeah, big, not so small, but big 5, and the word, not the number, so FIVE-test.com. So it should take around 10 minutes or so. If you're a bit slower, I may have to cut us off, so try to kind of go with your gut. Yes? So the question was, so I guess I'll say it's not based on mean and standard deviation. It's not like IQ, where it's normed around, where your score is defined in terms of a mean. So yeah, don't worry about that. Okay, it's 11:35. Show of hands if you are done, and if you're not done. So if you say, yeah, you should be able to finish after class. Okay, so as I said, it breaks them down into subcomponents. So this may help you remember what the 5 factors are about. It's always nice if you can connect the information to yourself. There are other versions of the Big 5 available online. I get somewhat different results depending on which test I use, which is in a way a bit of a problem, but this is a pretty standard one. So there you go. So what about biological underpinnings of these personality traits? So you'll recall that Hans Eysenck thought there were only 2 factors, but as I say, they correspond pretty well to 2 of the Big 5. One has the same name, extroversion, so that's the same as extroversion as the Big 5, at least roughly. And the other is stability, which would correspond to neuroticism. So Eysenck's theory is that extroversion has to do with arousal, level of arousal, and neuroticism has to do with suddenness of change. So his theory of extroversion may be a little counterintuitive at first. His theory is that extroverts are under-aroused. And by aroused, I just mean like, how much kind of anxious energy do you have? How much, it could be anxious or it could be good or bad, but just how energized are you? And introverts are over-aroused. And the idea here is that if you're under-aroused, you need more excitement. You're kind of easily bored. And as a result, you become more extroverted, right? You seek out thrills and parties and new people and new friends, etc. Whereas if you're an introvert, you're already kind of tense and highly aroused. So like, you know what? I'm good. I don't need any thrills. I'm just going to stay where I am. And then for neuroticism, or what he would call stability, which is kind of the opposite, he thought it was suddenness of neurological change. It's kind of how chaotic and quickly do your neural reactions occur. In both cases, we won't go into the details, but there is some evidence from neuroscience that's, broadly speaking, consistent with Eysenck's conjecture. That extroversion is correlated with measures of under-arousal, and that neuroticism is correlated with a sort of more sudden neural reactions. Or as the book says, hair-trigger nervous systems. Additionally, there's of course the standard method of looking at heritability. So that is evidence of some kind of biological underpinning of the traits. And in the case of the big five, they are not as heritable as IQ, but they still are significantly heritable, around 40 to 50%. So you do the standard thing, you look at twins raised apart, or you look at twins raised in the same family and compare the identical twins with the fraternal twins. In both cases, there is strong evidence of heritability. As I say, around 40 to 50%. So identical twins will be more similar for the big five than fraternal twins. The degree of test-retest reliability is around the same, around 0.4, 0.5. So again, not as high as IQ, but still quite high. So if you, and the example the book gives is a study where you give a test after a 20-year gap. So you give a person a test at one time, and then 20 years later, the correlation's around 0.4, 0.5. So still fairly high. On the next page, I have some notes about validity. Before I do that, though, I'll just quickly mention self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is something that could change how much the big five are expressed. People who are high in a trait called self-monitoring pay more attention to their behavior and change it depending on what context they're in. So if you're low, you're just yourself all the time. You don't pay attention to whether you're with family or friends or at a serious occasion. You're kind of just yourself all the time. If you're high in self-monitoring, you try to change your behavior to be appropriate to the situation. Okay. As I say, now I'll move on to the validity of these tests. And again, the correlations are not as big as they are for IQ in terms of predictive validity. So remember back in the chapter on intelligence, we saw that IQ is correlated with grades at around 0.5, maybe 0.6. In the case of the big five, there's not really one obvious behavioral criterion to use. There's different things you can use. And in most cases, the correlations range from around 0.2 to 0.4. It's kind of on the smaller side. I'll give some examples. You don't need to know the specific examples, but they'll give you a sense of the kinds of things that are used. So one behavior you can use is, do you play a musical instrument? This is unsurprisingly positively correlated with openness around 0.2. So people who are higher in openness are more likely to try learning a musical instrument. People who are higher in conscientiousness get better grades. Again, around 0.2. So not a very high correlation, but there is some relationship. In the study that I looked at, extroversion correlated with the most things. It was the best at predicting behavior. So it was correlated with popularity around 0.4, so that's a bit higher than the others. And your likelihood of going to a larger number of parties around 0.3. Agreeableness correlates with measures of honesty. And as I said, it also correlates with income, although income it correlates negatively. But it correlates with measures of honesty at around 0.2. And neuroticism correlates with your likelihood of being diagnosed with a depressive or anxious mental disorder at around 0.3. So those are some examples of the criterion validity of these measures. They do predict other outcomes, though not super high. Or super high. Okay, that is all I have to say about the Big Five. Any questions about the Big Five? As I say, these are good to know.
Do we need to know the subcategories of the
No, you do not need to know the subfacets of, at least not by name, but they will be helpful in terms of getting a broad sense of what these factors are getting at. But the only names you need to know are the five. So you don't need to memorize the exact names of the facets. Any other questions about the big five? Okay. Next, we'll talk about social cognitive theories. This is another umbrella of theories. I'm going to go in a somewhat different order than the book. The book talks about some ideas from Albert Bandura, and then locus of control, and then more Bandura stuff. I'm going to put the Bandura stuff together. So I'll start with locus of control. Locus of control is what you believe controls what happens to you. And there are two types: internal and external. So the idea here is, if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you control what happens to you. The locus of control, the thing that controls what happens to you, is yourself. An external locus of control would mean that you believe that the environment controls what happens to you. It's, conditioning or fate or whatever. Something that's not you controls what happens to you. Generally speaking, studies indicate that it is healthier to have an internal locus of control. As you might suspect, people with that kind of locus of control take more initiative and have more self-control, and therefore have better outcomes. So nothing too fancy there. That's locus of control. The next set of ideas comes from Albert Bandura. Bandura is a very important psychologist. Don't quote me on this, but I think at one point he overtook Chomsky and was for a while the most cited living person. He was, I'm quite sure, the most cited psychologist at one point. He passed away a few years ago. He's Canadian. He was born right here in Alberta and did his undergrad at BC, at UBC, sorry. So, very influential guy though, so we can have a little Canadian pride for him. One of his ideas is reciprocal determinism. The downside of new markers is that it is harder to erase. Reciprocal determinism states that there are three things that all can mutually influence each other. In other words, the connections between each of these things is bidirectional. Causal arrows can go both ways. So let me give some examples to illustrate that. Let's say that your environment kind of sucks. And to be more specific, let's say your parents are kind of mean. They hit you a lot or whatever. So you have kind of a harsh environment. That will influence you, your traits. So this one is like traits, right? Like what kind of a person you are. right? If your parents hit you a lot, perhaps you'll become more of a kind of angry, aggressive person as a result. So your traits will change. But that in turn will affect your behavior. Right? You're going to behave in a more obstinate, angry, aggressive way. So then you go to school and you're kind of a jerk. Kind of, getting lots of fights and stuff. But that will affect your environment. The environment is different for kids who are jerks. Right? The teachers get mad at them more, other kids get mad at them more, and so on, which may in turn make them a bit more of a jerk. Right? So that's one example of how the causal arrows could go in one way. But let's take a sunnier example. Let's say that just from the beginning, you're a more intellectually curious person. Let's say you have kind of a natural tendency towards liking books, liking to learn. So that's your disposition. That will, of course, affect your behavior, right? You'll express more interest in learning to your parents. And that may in turn affect your environment. Your parents may read to you more. The teachers at school may show more interest in you and show more encouragement towards you, which can then, increase your trait in that direction. So those are just some toy examples. Obviously, those aren't testable, but that reinforces the idea that these three can influence each other. Oh, I forgot to mention, Bandura is the same guy who did the Bobo doll study. I think I mentioned that in a prior class, the study where kids watch an adult beat the crap out of a Bobo doll. That's his study. He was right after the behaviorists, like around the time behaviorism was going down, and he emphasized that it's not all just environmental conditioning. It's one component of it, but humans are agents who can change their environment as well. It's not just the causal arrow is not just environment to person, it can go both ways. And then the only other thing you have to know from Bandura is a mostly unrelated term, which is self-efficacy. I feel like we already talked about this in another chapter too, but quick reminder, this is belief in your own effectiveness. So if you believe that you're capable of doing something, that would mean you're higher in self-efficacy. Oh, actually, yeah, we talked about this in bystander intervention. So if you have higher self-efficacy, you're more likely to help in an emergency situation if you believe that you're able to successfully help the person having a heart attack. Okay, so that's Bandura. Any questions on Bandura? The next character is Walter Mischel. It's probably most helpful to think of Mischel as a critic of the trait approach, at least a critic of an overly simplistic version of the trait approach. So traits are conceptualized as stable aspects of our personality, like extroversion or whatever. But think back to those correlations I talked about. How much do these traits predict our behavior? And as we saw, around 0.2 to 0.4. So not nothing, but Mischel pointed out, well, that's not very much. What he argued is that people do not behave very consistently across different contexts. And focusing too much on traits is misleading. We should focus more on the situation. So there's a big debate in personality theory between like the trait people and the situation people, and Mischel is squarely on team situation. He thinks that if you want to predict how people will behave, it's more important to take the situation into account. And you can think about that for yourself, right? Like if I asked you, how extroverted are you? I suspect for most of you, the answer would depend on who you're with. If you're with your family or close friends, probably many of you are going to be more talkative and outgoing. If you were to go into the faculty lounge and be in like a situation where you're with a bunch of professors, maybe you'd be a bit more nervous, right? Maybe not quite as outgoing and talkative. So that's the kind of thing Michelle would emphasize. He thought that what we have are if-then behavior contingencies. In other words, insofar as we can talk about traits at all, what we should talk about is we have dispositions such as, if I'm in this situation, then I'll behave like this. If I'm in this other situation, then I'll behave like this. If I'm with my close friends, I'll be a little more wild and uninhibited. If I'm with my superiors at work or with professors, okay, I'm going to be a bit more reserved. The book has a fancy term for this, cognitive affective personality system. I deleted that from the key terms in my last round of edits, so don't worry about that. Yes? There's certainly a similarity. You can put it like this, like Michelle emphasizes the environment bit. And not just environment like broadly construed, but the specific situation you're in. So it's not an environment like the behaviorists might say that the environment conditions you and makes you into a certain person. What Michelle is saying is, it's not like how your parents raise you or something like that. It's what specific situation are you in? And that will determine how you respond. Something else that Michelle studied was something called delay of gratification. This is an ability that most kids hopefully, learn to some extent when they are young. So it's the ability to put off a reward with patience and self-control. And Michelle devised a really clever little test for measuring the capacity to delay gratification in kids. I forget what age he studied, but at a certain age, it's really useful. You bring kids into the lab, and you give them a nice big marshmallow, and you say, okay, this is actually called the marshmallow test. You can look it up. And you tell the kid, okay, I'm going to leave for 10 minutes, and if the marshmallow is still here when I get back, then you'll get 2. Or if you want, you can eat it, and then that's all you get. It's up to you when the experimenter leaves. And the question is, do they eat the marshmallow or not? And Michelle found that this actually predicted future behavior. People who were able to delay gratification, like in this marshmallow test, were more likely to finish college, less likely to commit crime, and various other measures. So, you may be wondering, are there videos of this test? And you are all in luck, there are videos. So we'll watch some videos of some kids passing this test and other kids not doing so well. The last one's my favorite. Although you shouldn't have laughed. That kid grew up to be a drug addict. I'm just kidding. Well, actually, I don't know, maybe. Okay, so that's the marshmallow. Sorry, that's the marshmallow test. Yes.
With that, you say that it's deterministic of like future behaviors. Is it something that can be trained out of a kid, or?
I'm not an expert in this area. I had a buddy who read a book on the marshmallow test. He told me that it's something that can be trained, much more than say IQ. But I haven't read the book, so don't quote me on that. But yes, I believe it is something that you can practice. Okay, hopefully I still keep my job after that remark. Okay, so that's the end of the social cognitive theories. Any questions on them? Okay. So we're getting towards the end. The chapter concludes with different methods for assessing personality. A lot of these are ones that we've already talked about. So one is personality scales and self-report, so different self-report measures. So you all just completed an example of that. This is where you just ask people, how happy are you? How much do you like other people? How creative are you? Etc. as we've talked about in prior chapters, self-report always has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt because A, people may not have good introspective access into what their traits are, and they may lie. They may try to kind of bend their answers to make themselves look better. So you can also use physiological measures. So this is something that Isaac did. You can try to, now you have to have something to correlate it with, but you can look at the neural or other physiological correlates of different personality measures. You can measure behavior, something you can do as well. You can use interviews. We won't be talking too much about that, but you can do, instead of just a scale that you select, 1 to 5, you can do long-form interviews. One thing that you can do that is a really nice validity check for self-report is you can ask other people what that person's trait is like. So if you want to know how extroverted I am, you could ask me, or you could ask my family and friends. How outgoing is David? One thing that gives us more confidence that the Big Five is measuring something real is self-report and other report do strongly correlate. If you say you're pretty extroverted, your friends will on average tend to also say that you're extroverted. And then there's one other goofy method of measuring personality, which is projective tests. That one we'll talk about at the end. That's the final topic. So it talks about the reliability and validity of different personality measures. So that's mostly review from the intelligence chapter. So I've already talked a bit about that. So in the case of the Big Five, the test-retest reliability is around 0.4, 0.5. And in the case of specifically criterion validity, maybe 0.2 to 0.4. Right? That's about how strongly the Big Five tends to correlate with behavioral measures. If you are observing behavior, let's say you're observing kids' behavior and you want to infer what their personality traits are on that basis, you want to have high inter-rater reliability. That's another term we used in chapter 10. So if two different people are observing kids and recording their behavior, you want it to be the case that they agree highly. If they're using like some kind of checklist, it's a good checklist if it can be used easily to the point where two separate people will give similar answers when they observe people behavior. Another way of getting at behavior is to use remote behavior sampling. So in the old days, they had these clickers that you would use, or I guess they could have used phones as well, but they will call or text you at random times during the day and ask, "What are you doing?" And then you get a nice pattern, right? You can look at how often people tend to do different sorts of things, and you can use that as evidence to put together a picture of what their personality is. When constructing personality scales, like the Big Five or anything else, there are, broadly speaking, two different approaches, two different ways of doing it. One is the rational approach, and the other is the empirical approach. If you are using the rational approach, that means you decide which items go into the test based on some theory you have. Like rational means kind of like, using logic, not necessarily using the evidence directly. So you may have a theory that depression is about rumination, that what causes depression is when you kind of think too much, you ruminate on your thoughts. And so then when constructing a scale to measure depression, you include lots of items about rumination. because that's what your theory says is important when it comes to depression. If you use the empirical approach, you say, who needs these theory things? Let's just go with the evidence, specifically correlational evidence. So I wish I could remember which way this correlation went, but my professor talked about one example. So one test that falls under this category is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is an atheoretical test, meaning they don't have a sophisticated theory about what's measuring what. They put the test together on the basis of correlations. And it includes a number of dimensions that are pathological, so like a depressive tendency or a paranoid tendency or things like that. And my professor, who used to work as a clinical psychologist, he said that on the depression dimension, there was a question about how often you read newspaper comics. You may think, what does that have to do with depression? And the answer is, it's correlated with it. Do we have a theory about why that is? Nope. It correlates with it, so it goes on the test. So that's an example of using the empirical approach. Now, as I say, I forget which way the correlation goes. I'm pretty sure it was more comic book reading meant more depression, but don't quote me on that. So that's one example. Does that distinction make sense? Any questions? Yes? That's a good question. So this person asked, do the test items have different weight if they're correlated more or less with the dimension in question? The answer is I don't know. You won't have to know that level of detail. The thing to know is just that the items are chosen on the basis of correlations, not on the basis of a theory. Okay, good. I think we have just enough time to finish the chapter at just the right time to talk about projective tests. These tests are popular with Freudians and neo-Freudians, so people who are broadly speaking in the psychodynamic school. So as you should know by now, people in the Freudian tradition emphasize the importance of the unconscious, including in personality theory. Now, one problem with the unconscious is you can't ask people about it, right? If I ask, what are you unconsciously thinking about? You know, by definition, you can't answer. If you do, then you didn't understand the question. So, one method that they use is, as I say, projective tests. These tests involve the presentation of an ambiguous stimulus that you have to project something onto. So the stimulus itself is unclear. It could be different things. And then you have to project something. So one example, which I have an example of right here, is the Rorschach test. Rorschach ink blot test. So the stimulus is ambiguous. This is just a random ink blot. Like there's no one drew anything here on purpose. It's just a bunch of random ink on a page. You just kind of fold the page in half so that it's a symmetrical image. And then the question is, what do you see? The reason the Freudians like this is they would say what's going on is your unconscious is projecting something onto it. And so if we give you enough of these, we may pick up on a pattern. One won't be enough, but with a few, if you tend to give certain kinds of answers, that may tell us something about you. Now, I don't know there is actually a formal way of scoring the test. I don't know how that works, but let's have some fun. Someone tell me, what do you see in this picture? Not all at once. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. So a skull in the center with a spear and flames. See me after class, you need help. No. Yes?
I kind of see a dragon.
A dragon? Yeah, these are all pretty common answers. Yeah, so skull, dragon. Anyone see anything else? A lizard with hands? That's closer to what I see, yeah.
Is it bottom part kind of the pelvis bone?
A what?
The pelvis bone.
A what?
Bone, pelvis.
Oh, pelvis bone. Oh, okay, interesting. So Freud may read something into that. Okay, so no, I don't actually know how to score these, but okay. So then here's another one. So you kind of get the idea, right? So this is a good example of a projective test because the images are ambiguous and you have to project something onto it. These are pretty controversial. I'm not an expert in the literature, but many people argue that these have very little validity, that they're used almost out of habit more so than anything else. So that's the Rorschach. The other kind of projective test is the thematic apperception test. Psychologists like to give fancy names to simple things. So thematic apperception test, or TAT. In this case, you are shown an image and you have to tell a story about what just happened. And you kind of are supposed to say the first thing that comes to your mind. So anyone want to tell me what happened to this woman in the, let's say, 5 minutes prior to this?
Hangover?
Someone says hangover. Okay, so again, see me after class. No. Yep.
Probably just finished some homework and is tired and wants to go to sleep. Speaking from proper experience.
Right, interesting. So that may reflect what you were unconsciously preoccupied with. Yes.
You can kind of see your other hand is like clutching her arm, she's fighting, so maybe she got some terrible news that her family member died or something.
Right. Could be terrible news that a family member died. Yeah. So good. So that's how you would use this test. And then again, you can't really infer much based on one. You give a set of items and then make some judgment on that basis. Now to close us off, I have another projective test. This one is probably even less valid than these two. This one's more of a party trick, but it is sort of interesting. And that's the walk in the woods test. Do any of you know this test? Okay, so here's the test. On your computer or on your notepad, write down kind of the first few things that come to mind as I go through the steps. So you are to imagine that you are walking through the woods and look around at the woods. Look at the forest you're in. Write a few things down about what the forest is like. And I won't say anything more than that so I don't bias you. What kind of forest is it? What does it look like? Etc. Just the first few things. Okay, once you've taken a few notes down for that, now look at the path. You're on a path or trail in the woods. What is the path like? Again, say the first things that visually come to your mind. Okay, the path comes to a river. Describe the river. What does the river look like? You have to get across the river somehow. How do you do it? Again, there's no wrong answer, whatever comes to your mind first. After crossing the river, you see a bear. Describe the bear. And then write down how you get past the bear. You have to get out of this forest, you have to somehow get past it. What strategy comes to your mind for getting past the bear? Okay, and we're almost done. You then come up to a wall. Describe the wall. And then finally, how do you get to the other side of the wall? And once you get to the other side, what do you see? What is on the other side of the wall? Okay, so as I say, this is not a particularly valid test as far as I know. It's more of a party trick. But here's the interpretation. So this would count as a projective test because the information I've given is ambiguous and the answer you give indicates something about what you are bringing to the table. So the way of interpreting it is, the way you describe the forest indicates what you think of your friends. So, or your friend group. What you wrote about the path indicates what you think about your life, the direction of your life. So windy, well, you all know what windy means, and so on. How you view the river is reflective of how you view love, romantic love. And how you get across the river indicates what you do when love is on offer. So that's what that is supposed to predict, and I see some laughter. The bear is how you view your problems, and then how you deal with your problems. And then the wall represents death and what you think of the afterlife. So there you go. Again, not an especially valid test, but it would count as projective. Okay, next class we'll start chapter 3.